Hey guys, tonight we're going to take a very slow, very long ride. No, not a real train, so don't worry about tickets or baggage. I'm talking about the Orphan Train. So dim the lights, get comfortable, maybe wrap yourself in a blanket, because this one is about kids, trains, and just a dash of 19th century chaos. And yes, as always, it's one of those stories where adults thought they were doing something noble, but then kind of forgot to think about the consequences. Alright, let's roll back in time. It's the mid-1800s in New York City. The streets are crowded, noisy, and let's be honest, filthy. Horses clattering, smoke filling the air, vendors shouting over each other. But the real standout sight wasn't the skyscrapers, because spoiler, those didn't exist yet, it was the kids. Thousands of them, barefoot, dirty, wandering around in little packs. Some were orphans, some were abandoned, and some just had parents too poor to feed them, so they were sort of half orphans by circumstance. The newspapers at the time loved a good moral panic. They called them street urchins, ragamuffins, or my personal favorite, the dangerous class. Because, nothing says compassion like labeling a 9-year-old as a public menace. And to be fair, there were a lot of them. Estimates say something like 30,000 homeless children in New York City by the 1850s. That's not a typo, 30,000, which is a lot of tiny humans trying to survive on stale bread crusts and whatever scraps they could hustle. Naturally, wealthy reformers started getting uncomfortable. And when rich Victorians got uncomfortable, they tended to invent solutions that were equal parts creative, ambitious, and slightly horrifying. Enter Charles Loring Brace. Brace was a Protestant minister. He looked around at all these kids running around and thought, well, this just won't do. His idea? Simple, ship them out. Put the children on trains and send them to rural America, where, according to him, they'd be taken in by good, wholesome farm families. Because if there's anything wholesome about 19th century farming families, it's the way they just love adopting extra mouths to feed. The plan sounded nice on paper. The idea was, these kids would be raised in clean, healthy environments. They'd learn the value of hard work. And best of all, they'd get out of New York, which everyone agreed was basically an urban dumpster fire at the time. And thus, the Orphan Train movement was born in 1854. Now picture this. Dozens of kids, ages 3 all the way up to 16, lined up and put on trains. The trains rolled westward, sometimes hundreds of miles, to towns in the Midwest, places like Ohio, Indiana, Iowa, Kansas. And when they got there, the children were paraded out in front of local townsfolk, literally displayed, like tiny cattle at an auction. The locals would come by, look the kids over, and decide if they wanted one. A strong boy, perfect for farm labor. A quiet girl, great, she can help with housework. A toddler, adorable accessory. Someone might take 2 or 3 at once, like they were picking apples at a market. And of course, no one used the word auction. That would sound cruel. Instead, they called it placing out, which is basically the same thing, but with a softer spin. Now, was this technically adoption? Not always. Adoption laws weren't really standardized yet. Sometimes kids got new families and legal papers. Sometimes they were just taken in as unpaid farmhands. Sometimes they were treated kindly, raised as part of the household. And sometimes, not so much. This brings us to the missing children part of the story. Because here's the thing, once those kids left New York, no one really kept track. Records were sketchy at best. Imagine handing a 6-year-old to a stranger in Nebraska, waving goodbye, and then just never checking in. That was the system. Brace and his organization, the Children's Aid Society, insisted it was working beautifully. They published glowing reports about grateful children being transformed into model citizens. But of course, those reports were written by the same people running the program. Convenient. Meanwhile, letters started trickling back from kids who weren't exactly living the dream. Some were overworked, some were neglected, some simply ran away and vanished. And some, well, no one ever heard from them again. Missing, swallowed up by the prairie, the towns, the silence. It's not that every child suffered. Plenty of families genuinely did take them in, fed them, raised them, and gave them opportunities. But the gaps in oversight were big enough to drive, well, a train through, and the darker stories have a way of lingering. Let's float over for a moment to what it actually looked like when the trains arrived. Imagine you're in a small town in Iowa. It's 1870. A train pulls into the station. Out step 50 children, lined up neatly, wearing simple clothes that look freshly scrubbed. The townsfolk gather. The local newspaper prints an announcement. Orphan Train to arrive Friday, families invited. The kids are brought into a hall, maybe the courthouse, maybe a church basement, and one by one, they're brought forward. People point, whisper, decide. Maybe they tug at a boy's arm muscles. Maybe they ask a girl if she can sew. Maybe they just look at the child's face and decide yes or no. The children who weren't chosen right away, they went back on the train and were carted along to the next town. Sometimes this went on for weeks. And yes, the kids noticed when they were passed over again and again. Nothing like rejection to build character, right? One of the saddest ironies is that not all the kids were technically orphans. Some had living parents who, out of desperation, had given them up in the hope of a better life. And because paperwork wasn't exactly thorough, reunions were almost impossible. Parents came back looking for their children years later, only to find that the trail had gone cold. That's where the missing part gets extra tragic, because these weren't just anonymous faces. These were sons and daughters, and once they got on that train, they might as well have disappeared into thin air. Now, to be fair, Brace genuinely believed he was saving them. He wasn't a cartoon villain twirling his mustache. He was reacting to a real problem, thousands of kids starving on the streets. The orphan trains did place around 200,000 children over 75 years, which, in sheer numbers, is staggering. But the lack of follow-up, the way it stripped kids of their identities, their names, even their religions, it's hard not to look back and cringe. Catholic kids were often placed with Protestant families, sometimes deliberately, as a form of conversion. Irish kids were sent to farms where no one could even pronounce their names. Siblings were split apart, and once you were placed, your past basically didn't exist anymore. Let's take a slow breath here, because I know this is heavy, but remember, we're not rushing. What makes the Orphan Train story so haunting is exactly this, the silence that followed. Those missing children didn't make headlines, they didn't get memorials, they just blended into the fabric of rural America, their New York roots erased. Some scholars call it America's first foster care system, which is true, but it was also, in many ways, America's first great experiment in losing track of children. And like most 19th century experiments, medicine, politics, or otherwise, the people running it were very confident, very optimistic, and very wrong about half the outcomes. Let's glide now to a little perspective. The Orphan Train program officially ran from 1854 until 1929. By the time it ended, adoption laws had improved, social services were more developed, and America had realized, very slowly, that maybe mass exporting children like livestock wasn't the most compassionate system. But the missing kids, the ones who vanished into history, they never got tallies, no final count, just echoes of names in old registers and the occasional family today who discovers their great-grandparent arrived in town off one of those trains. It's the kind of history that's both impressive in terms of scale and quietly chilling when you zoom in on the personal details. So that's where we'll pause tonight, on this strange train ride through America's past. A ride full of hope, loss, and a lot of unanswered questions. Because the Orphan Train wasn't just a piece of history, it was a story of children who vanished into new lives, some better, some worse, and some simply gone. Take another breath, let your mind slow down. And when you're ready, we'll drift onward to the next tale of misplaced royals, tragic heirs, or another historical disaster dressed up as a solution. So we're still on the train. It's rattling along, clunky wheels on iron rails, kids pressed against the windows watching the countryside blur past. None of them really know where they're headed, except that it's away. And away can mean a lot of things: away from hunger, away from crowded tenements, away from parents who couldn't cope. But it also meant away from everything familiar. And for a 7-year-old, that's a pretty big deal. The Children's Aid Society kept the kids in groups. They were usually accompanied by an agent, someone whose job was to supervise the journey. This agent would make sure the children didn't bolt, kept them reasonably tidy, and then presented them at the destination like a polite salesperson. Think of it like the world's most depressing roadshow. When they reached a town, the kids were scrubbed up, sometimes dressed in matching outfits to make them look neater. Which sounds sweet until you realize it was more about presentation than comfort. Uniformity made them seem more adoptable, almost like little catalog items. The gatherings were called distribution meetings. Lovely phrase, right? As if children were flour sacks or bolts of cloth. The kids would be arranged in rows, and families came forward to choose. Sometimes there were speeches, prayers, or a stern reminder that these children were gifts from God. But after the pious words, it came down to who wanted which kid. And here, where it gets awkward, families didn't always want to adopt in the way we think of adoption today. They wanted workers. A boy who looked sturdy might be picked up to plow fields. A girl might be taken because she looked like she could handle laundry and endless bread making. Older children, especially boys around 14 or 15, often had the hardest time. They were too big to be cute, too old to be pliable. Families worried they'd run away or have bad habits. Younger ones, toddlers and grade school kids, were scooped up faster, often because they could be molded into whatever the household needed. The unlucky ones went back on the train, over and over, town to town, being passed over while other kids got picked. You can imagine what that did to their little psyches. Some accounts from children themselves give us a glimpse of what it felt like. One recalled being paraded on a stage and inspected like livestock. He remembered a man tugging at his arms to check muscle strength. Another girl remembered being asked if she could sew and cook, even though she was only 9. And for the ones not chosen, sometimes townsfolk weren't subtle. They'd mutter things like, too scrawny or doesn't look healthy. Kids heard those words, they understood. Rejection stings when you're grown. When you're a child trying to find a home, it sinks deeper. Now let's not get too grim. Some placements did work out. There are documented stories of children who grew up genuinely loved, educated, and given a real future. Some even went on to become teachers, ministers, shop owners, solid members of their communities. Those are the happy endings Brace liked to publish in his reports. But the not-so-happy endings, those got brushed under the rug. Some kids ended up in homes where they were treated as servants. Imagine being 9 years old and expected to wake before dawn, milk cows, scrub floors, and collapse in bed after a full day of labor, all while watching the family's biological children get schooling and affection. Others faced outright abuse. Beatings weren't exactly rare in the 19th century, but for orphan train kids, there was no safety net. If things went wrong, no one came to check. No surprise home visits. No hotline to call. The agent who left them there had already moved on with the next train load. And then, of course, there were the kids who just vanished. Here's the thing, records were sloppy. Sometimes names got misspelled. Sometimes entire batches of children weren't logged properly. There were stories of siblings placed in separate homes who never saw each other again. A brother might end up in Missouri while his sister was sent to Kansas, and that was it. Good luck finding each other without phones, internet, or even consistent mail service. Some children ran away, especially the older ones who could fend for themselves. They'd drift from town to town, working odd jobs, disappearing into the background of frontier life, which means they're basically untraceable in the historical record. They became part of the missing, even if they were technically still alive. And then there are darker suspicions. Children dying young from overwork or neglect, unmarked grave on farms, quiet burials no one ever reported. These weren't counted. They weren't mourned publicly. They just faded out. The scale of the missing is impossible to calculate. Historians admit that for every success story, there are unknown numbers of children whose stories simply stopped. Let's float back into the mindset of the townsfolk. For rural families, the arrival of an orphan train could feel exciting. Newspapers often wrote about it like a festive event. Crowds turned out at stations. Some towns even treated it like entertainment, coming just to watch, even if they had no intention of taking in a child. But behind the excitement was always that transactional vibe. Families asked practical questions. Could the boy hold a plow? Could the girl handle laundry for 8 people? Would they cost too much to feed? Love wasn't always the selling point. Utility was. And of course, not everyone in town was thrilled. Some locals worried that orphans would bring bad blood, or that city kids might carry crime, disease, or laziness with them. There was a lot of bias, especially against Irish or Catholic children, which meant some kids were stigmatized before they even stepped off the train. One detail that's especially haunting is how children were sometimes renamed. Families might not like the sound of their given name, too foreign, too urban, too Irish, so they just change it. Imagine being 7, already disoriented, and suddenly someone says, "We'll call you Mary now." Goodbye to the name your parents gave you. Goodbye to the last piece of your identity. Others were made to stop practicing their religion. Catholic kids often ended up in Protestant households where they were told to drop old traditions. It wasn't just a new home, it was a full reboot. For some children, this meant survival. For others, it meant a lifelong feeling of being lost. So did anyone notice the flaws? Eventually, yes. Catholic organizations in particular were very critical of Brace's Protestant-driven system. They saw it as a sneaky way to convert Catholic kids. Other critics worried about the lack of oversight and the risks of exploitation. By the early 1900s, more formal foster care systems were developing. Laws around adoption became stricter, and gradually, the orphan train faded out. The last official ride was in 1929, just as the Great Depression was hitting. And by then, the whole idea of shipping children around in bulk was starting to feel outdated, even by early 20th century standards. But the damage was done. Thousands of children grew up cut off from their families, their roots erased, their childhoods shaped by strangers. Some adapted, some thrived, and some never stopped feeling displaced. Today, descendants of orphan train riders sometimes piece together family histories. There are museums, research centers, even reunions where people discover that their grandparent came to town on one of those trains. It's like uncovering a ghost in the family tree. But for every story recovered, there are countless others that remain blank, names lost, children missing, and silence filling the gaps. So here we are, still sitting with this long, rattling ride through America's forgotten corners. The orphan train movement was both massive and strangely invisible. Massive in that it involved 200,000 children. Invisible in that so many of those children disappeared into anonymity. It was a solution designed to clean up the streets of New York, but in the process, it scattered children like seeds across the prairie, seeds that sometimes grew and sometimes withered unnoticed. And maybe that's the most unsettling part, not the dramatic tragedies, not the newspaper scandals, but the quiet vanishing, the missing children who left no stories behind. All right, let's take another deep breath here. We've ridden this train for a while now, the night's still long, the rails are still stretching out ahead, and as always, history just keeps rolling. So next, we'll drift onward, still in the same slow, steady rhythm, toward the legacy these trains left behind, and how they shaped the way America thinks about children, families, and the messy business of trying to fix society's problems by relocating the vulnerable. So the trains have stopped. The children have stepped off, the families have chosen, and the prairie silence has swallowed them up. But what happened after? What became of all those small passengers once they grew up, had lives of their own, and looked back on that strange chapter? Well, the truth is, it's complicated. Some remembered their journeys with gratitude, others with bitterness, and many, like most people who have gone through trauma, didn't talk much about it at all. Let's start with the success stories, because yes, they existed. There were children who were taken in by kind families, raised with affection, given schooling, and taught skills that helped them thrive. Some became farmers, teachers, ministers, shopkeepers. A few even entered politics. One former Orphan Train rider, Andrew Burke, actually grew up to become the governor of North Dakota in the 1890s. Not exactly a small achievement for someone who started life abandoned in New York. Others spoke about the kindness of their foster parents, the way they were welcomed, given clean clothes, fed properly, and treated no differently than the biological children of the household. For those lucky few, the Orphan Train wasn't a nightmare. It was a turning point. But for every sunny memory, there was a darker one. Survivors also spoke about being treated as laborers, about rising at 4 in the morning to tend animals, working through blistering summers and freezing winters, and collapsing into bed without much kindness or care. Some never attended school, some were punished harshly, some were always the outsider, never fully part of the family. One woman recalled being told she was lucky to even be taken in. Another remembered her foster siblings calling her the hired girl, not their sister, and the idea of family, for them, always carried an asterisk. There were also stories of abuse, physical, emotional, even worse. And without oversight, without laws protecting them, those children had no recourse. They endured it or they ran. And if they ran, they usually disappeared for good. Here, where things get especially haunting. Many Orphan Train children never knew their real last names. Some were given new ones, others forgot the old ones. A child who left New York as Patrick O'Malley might end up in Kansas as John Smith. Try tracing your family tree with that kind of identity swap. As adults, some tried to reconnect with their past. They wrote to the Children's Aid Society asking for records. Often, the society had nothing to give. Paperwork was missing. Files were incomplete. Some children had been logged only as boy, age 8, Irish. Not exactly helpful for a reunion. So in the end, many never knew who they were or where they came from. And that's not just sad, it's a kind of erasure. Let's float for a moment into the bigger picture. The Orphan Train was, in some ways, the birth of modern foster care in America. It introduced the idea that children without stable homes shouldn't just be locked up in institutions or left on the streets. They could live with families. That was, in theory, a huge step forward. But in practice, it set up a tension that still exists today, the line between care and exploitation, the line between you're part of our family and you're here to do work, and the line between saving children and erasing them. Culturally, the Orphan Trains also fed into that American frontier myth. You know the one, the idea that the prairie was a place where anyone could start fresh, where hard work solved everything, where the past didn't matter. For adults, that was already a kind of fantasy. For children, it was even more extreme. Imagine being told, forget your old life, your name, your parents, your language, your faith, you live here now. That's the frontier dream, but turned into childhood reality. It worked for some, it broke others, and it left behind a patchwork of stories, some inspiring, some painful, many missing. So how do we know any of this? Well, later in the 20th century, Historians, journalists, and descendants started collecting oral histories. Survivors of the orphan trains were interviewed in their old age. Some shared vivid memories, the rattling trains, the townsfolk staring, the fear of not being chosen. One man remembered the sound of the train whistle as the moment his old life ended. Another said he still dreamed about standing in a line, waiting to be picked. These memories stuck, even 70 years later. Others were more guarded. Some refused to talk about it at all, which, in its own way, tells us plenty. Silence can be as revealing as words. Meanwhile, families of origin, those parents who gave up their children, were often left out of the story entirely. Immigrant mothers, widowed fathers, families crushed by poverty, they handed over their kids hoping they'd have better lives. Did they ever see them again? Almost never. Did they regret it? Almost always. But history didn't bother recording their grief. They vanish from the narrative just like their children. And then there's the missing category. We'll never know how many children died young, buried in rural cemeteries under new names. We'll never know how many ran away and lived the rest of their lives under assumed identities. We'll never know how many were abused so badly that their stories ended quietly without record. Which means the orphan train legacy is always incomplete, a giant ledger with thousands of blank spaces. But here, the ironic twist. Today, the orphan train has become kind of a romanticized piece of history. There are museums, documentaries, even children's books that tell the story in a gentle, hopeful way. They focus on the plucky kids who found homes, the kind families who opened their doors. And that's fine, people like hopeful stories, but it also glosses over the messiness, the trauma, the lost names, the missing lives. It's like America wants to remember the orphan train as a symbol of generosity, while quietly ignoring the children who slipped through the cracks. If you want a modern comparison, think about today's foster system. There are still success stories, there are still horror stories, there are still children who get lost in the shuffle. The orphan train wasn't some bizarre one-off experiment. It was the beginning of a pattern that continues in different forms. The difference is, today, we at least try to keep records, usually. Let's drift now into the legacy for descendants. Imagine finding out your grandmother wasn't from the town she always claimed, but actually arrived on a train with no luggage and no parents. Imagine tracing your family tree and hitting a dead end, because the person at the root of it all never knew their own origins. That's the kind of mystery orphan train families face. Some descendants take pride in it, others feel unsettled, some are still searching. And every once in a while, there's a breakthrough. Someone finds a name in an old ledger, connects it to a passenger list, and suddenly a branch of the family tree is restored. Those moments are rare, but powerful. They're also reminders that the missing never completely disappear. They linger in family stories, half-remembered names, and DNA tests that suddenly reveal Irish roots where no one expected them. So here we are. We've traveled with the children from the crowded streets of New York, onto the rattling trains, into the small town halls, and out into the fields of rural America. We've seen the hopes, the hardships, the losses. We've heard the echoes of those who remembered and the silence of those who didn't. The orphan train wasn't just transportation, it was transformation. Sometimes it saved children, sometimes it erased them, and often it did both at the same time. And if that feels unresolved, well, it is. History doesn't always tie itself up neatly, especially not when children are involved. Let's pause here. Take a slow breath. Let the train whistle fade in your imagination. Picture the long prairie horizon, the small towns, the children stepping down onto unfamiliar soil. And then picture the silence that followed, stretching out across years, decades, and generations. That's the legacy of the orphan trains, not just what happened, But what disappeared? So we've met the children, we've watched them step down into unfamiliar towns, we've listened to the silence that followed. But now, let's turn the spotlight back to the adults, the ones who built this whole system in the first place. Because if you want to understand the orphan trains, you have to understand the reformers. And reformers in the 19th century were a particular breed. Let's go back to Charles Loring Brace, the man with the plans. Brace was born in 1826, educated at Yale, and ordained as a Protestant minister. He looked around at New York City, teeming with poor immigrants, ragged children, Catholic parishes springing up everywhere, and decided the city was in moral crisis. To him, the street children weren't just hungry, they were dangerous. He believed poverty bred vice, crime, and godlessness. His solution wasn't to fix the city, or improve housing, or raise wages. No, his solution was to extract the children, remove them from the corrupting environment of New York, and replant them in wholesome soil. Basically, he wanted to do agricultural work, but with people. Children as crops, families as fields, and morality as fertilizer. Brace genuinely thought he was being compassionate. In his writings, he called the children little waifs, gutter snipes, and the dangerous class, which doesn't sound very tender, but for him, it was motivation. He wanted to save them before they became hardened criminals. His philosophy was drenched in Protestant values. He believed rural Protestant America was morally superior to urban immigrant New York, which conveniently also meant Protestant families were the ideal recipients for these children. Catholic kids were quietly redirected into Protestant homes whenever possible, because why not fix poverty and religion in one go? Two birds, one train. And of course, Brace wasn't alone. Other reformers joined in. The Children's Aid Society, founded in 1853, became the main engine of the Orphan Train movement. They fundraised, published reports, and like all good reform organizations, produced an endless supply of pamphlets. The pamphlets told heartwarming stories: a ragged boy rescued from the streets, a fresh start in Iowa, a bright future in God's country. It was all very uplifting. Conveniently, they left out the harsher details, because donors liked happy endings, not grim reality. Let's float into the rhetoric for a minute. Reformers insisted that children needed to be removed from bad influences, which usually meant poor immigrant neighborhoods. Irish Catholics were a particular target. Brace was not subtle about his dislike for them. He once described Irish immigrant parents as hopelessly ignorant and incapable of raising decent children, which is a polite way of saying he thought he knew better. So while the Orphan Train was advertised as charity, it also carried a heavy dose of cultural engineering. It wasn't just about rescuing kids. It was about reshaping them into the kind of Americans reformers wanted. Now, were there critics? Absolutely. Catholic leaders saw the trains as thinly disguised Protestant proselytizing. They started their own orphanages and foster programs to keep Catholic kids within the faith. Newspapers sometimes raised eyebrows about the lack of oversight, and occasionally, families complained when a placement went wrong. But overall, the trains kept rolling. Why? Because they solved a visible problem. New York streets looked cleaner, wealthy donors felt satisfied, rural families got free labor, or if we're being generous, help. And the children? Well, the children didn't have much say in the matter. The movement lasted for 75 years, from 1854 all the way to 1929, which is a long time for what was essentially an improvised social experiment. Think about that. Generations of kids boarded those trains. By the end, more than 200,000 children had been relocated. Some historians argue that no other child welfare program in America has ever moved so many children so far. And yet, the cracks were always there. By the early 1900s, the social landscape was shifting. The progressive era brought new ideas about child welfare. Child labor laws started to appear. Adoption laws were being standardized. People began to say out loud what had been obvious all along. Maybe it wasn't great to ship kids across the country with little oversight and no guarantee of safety. Agencies started experimenting with local foster care instead of distant placements. The idea was children should stay closer to their communities, keep ties to family, culture, and language whenever possible. Revolutionary thinking, apparently. By the 1920s, the orphan train looked outdated. It was a relic of a cruder, rougher approach. And then came the Great Depression. Suddenly, rural families had enough trouble feeding their own children, let alone taking in extra ones from New York. In 1929, the last official orphan train rolled out. No fanfare, no big announcement, just the end of the line. Now let's take a slow breath, because the end of the trains wasn't really the end of the story. The legacy lived on in the foster care system, in adoption practices, in the way America thinks about saving children by moving them. The orphan train created a model: when in doubt, relocate, remove children from their environment, start fresh somewhere else. That model has echoed through history. Native American children were removed from their families and placed in boarding schools or with white families. Poor children in later decades were shuttled through foster homes with little continuity. The logic, take them out of the bad place, put them in the good place, has proved stubbornly durable. And each time, the same questions arise. Who decides what's a bad place? Who decides what's good? And what happens to the children in between? For the orphan train kids, those questions were rarely answered. They were just expected to adapt, to become whoever their new families wanted them to be. Some did, some didn't, and some disappeared so completely that we only know them as statistics, numbers on a ledger, dates on a passenger list, nameless children on fading photographs. Meanwhile, Charles Loring Brace remained convinced he'd done the right thing. He died in 1890, long before the trains ended. His organization carried on without him, and to this day, the Children's Aid Society still exists, though in a very different form. They provide social services, education programs, and notably, no longer put children on trains. But Brace's legacy is complicated. Was he a visionary? Maybe. Was he arrogant, paternalistic, and blind to the human cost of his experiment? Also, yes. He was a man of his time, confident, reform-minded, sure he knew what was best for everyone else, which is exactly the kind of person history produces in bulk. So, what do we do with this story? Do we remember the orphan train as a bold act of charity that saved thousands of children, or as a misguided experiment that erased identities and left countless lives untraceable? The answer, inconveniently, is both. It was a massive social intervention. It did save some children. It did doom others. It was both noble and negligent, which is why it makes such a perfectly weird piece of history to lull you to sleep with. Let's pause here. Imagine the last orphan train rolling out in 1929. Picture the children on board, clutching little bundles of belongings, peering out the windows at an uncertain future. Some of them would go on to tell their stories. Some never would. And with that final whistle, the experiment ended. But its echoes are still rattling in the background, even now. So the trains have stopped. The stations are empty. The children have all been placed, or not placed, and the prairie has gone quiet again. But history doesn't end just because the paperwork does. The echoes of the orphan trains kept bouncing through people's lives long after the last whistle blew in 1929. And here, where things get a little more ghostly. Imagine this. It's the 1970s, somewhere in the Midwest. An elderly woman sits in her armchair watching the evening news. She's in her 80s now. Gray hair, worn hands, the kind of face that tells you she's lived through several lifetimes worth of weather. Someone asks her about her childhood, and she hesitates. Then she says very quietly, "I came here on one of the trains." For decades, many orphan train riders never spoke about it. They folded that part of their lives away, tucked in the back of memory like an old photograph no one wants to frame. Maybe it was too painful. Maybe it was too ordinary to mention. Or maybe they were told so often to forget the past that they eventually did. But when they reached old age, some began to talk. And that's how historians, journalists, and curious descendants finally pieced together the real story. The memories were a mix. Some were proud. "I was given a home, I worked hard, I made something of myself." These survivors framed their experience as a tough but necessary path. They echoed the old American ideal, struggle builds character. Others were bitter. "I was never wanted. I was treated as hired help. I never belonged." These voices remind us that not all homes were safe havens. For some, the orphan train was less a rescue and more a sentence. And then there were the quiet ones, the ones who said little, offered only fragments, or brushed it off entirely. Silence can be self-protection, or maybe it's just what happens when the past feels too heavy to carry into words. One recurring theme was identity, or the loss of it. Many riders grew up not knowing their real birthdays, their real last names, or where they came from. One woman recalled celebrating her birthday in October every year, only to learn decades later she'd actually been born in March. Someone had just picked a date when she was placed, and that became her birthday. Another remembered that her foster parents renamed her on the spot. She lived her entire life under a name chosen by strangers. Imagine carrying that for 70 years, knowing your original self was buried under a word you didn't choose. That's the kind of quiet ache that lingers long after the train ride is over. By the late 20th century, researchers began organizing reunions. Yes, reunions for orphan train riders. Picture it, elderly men and women gathering in hotel ballrooms or community centers, introducing themselves to others who had once been children on those trains. For many, it was the first time they spoke openly about their shared experience. They told stories, compared memories, tried to make sense of it all. Some laughed about the quirks, some cried over the losses, and all of them seemed a little surprised that anyone finally cared to ask. Out of those gatherings came memoirs, interviews, and eventually museums. In Concordia, Kansas, there's now the National Orphan Train Complex, a museum dedicated to preserving this odd, sprawling chapter of American history. Which is, when you think about it, a little ironic, because for decades, the children themselves weren't given much of a voice, but now their lives are literally exhibits. Let's float now into how America remembers the orphan trains. When you read modern accounts or children's books written about it, the story often tilts toward the inspirational. It's framed as a grand adventure, brave children riding west, kind families welcoming them in, a land of opportunity. It's not exactly false, but it's selective. It emphasizes the happy endings. It smooths over the harsher details. It makes the story safe enough to tell in classrooms to fourth graders who might not be ready to hear about child labor, abuse, or the ones who disappeared. In other words, the orphan train has become part of America's myth-making machine, a tale of resilience, a feel-good version of hardship, which is exactly the kind of bedtime story we like to tell ourselves as a country. But underneath, the myth is that persistent silence. The missing children, the unnamed grave, the letters never answered, the parents who searched and never found. That silence is the real legacy, because you can build museums, write novels, and celebrate the survivors, but you can't fill in all the blank spaces. And maybe that's what makes the orphan train such a haunting story. It's not the dramatic tragedies, it's the absence, the sense that thousands of lives were scattered like seeds, and we'll never know how most of them grew, or if they grew at all. Let's take a small step back and look at the bigger picture again. The Orphan Train was born out of reformers' good intentions, or at least what they thought were good intentions. It operated for 75 years, relocating 200,000 children. It shaped families, towns, and generations in ways we can't fully map. But it also exposed the flaws of that era's social thinking. The idea that children could be fixed by relocation, that identity didn't matter, that families were interchangeable, that oversight was optional. And those ideas didn't disappear with the last train in 1929. They resurfaced in other child welfare experiments, Native American boarding schools, mid-century foster systems, even international adoption practices. The same logic, dressed in new clothes. So when we look back at the Orphan Train, we're not just looking at a quirky historical footnote. We're looking at the root of a pattern of adults deciding, confidently, what was best for children, while the children themselves had no voice. And now, here we are, 100 years later, sitting in the dark, whispering the story like a bedtime ghost tale. The children are long gone, the reformers are buried, the trains are rusted relics in old photographs, but the questions linger. What does it mean to save a child? What does it mean to erase one? And how do we hold both truths at once? So as we close this part, let's take a slow breath. Picture the prairie at dusk. Imagine an old train fading into the horizon, and hear the faint echo of voices, children's voices, calling, whispering, fading, some grateful, some resentful, some just gone. That's the echo of the orphan trains. Not a whistle, not a roar, just a long, soft silence. So the trains are gone, the riders have aged, and the echoes are faint. But memory has a funny way of reshaping history. Sometimes it polishes it, sometimes it exaggerates it, and sometimes it just leaves out the uncomfortable bits because, well, bedtime stories work better without too much grit in the gears. The Orphan Train, as it turns out, is one of those stories that slid very smoothly into American folklore. Think about it. What do Americans love more than the idea of rugged individuals starting fresh on the frontier? Throw in a train, add children, and you've basically got the plot of a dozen novels and movies waiting to happen. By the mid-20th century, popular writers began mining the Orphan Train for inspiration. Children's authors especially leaned into it. It made for a perfect mix of danger and optimism, kids without families, heading west into the unknown and finding new beginnings. Sort of like Little House on the Prairie, but with a darker twist and slightly less wholesome butter churning. Of course, those stories often skipped the awkward details, like children being paraded in lineups or being sent to homes that treated them more like free farmhands than beloved sons and daughters. Instead, fiction focused on plucky protagonists, courage, new horizons, happy endings neatly tied up in the last chapter. It's not that those stories are wrong, it's just that they're incomplete. But incomplete is often how national myths survive. Let's glide into film for a moment. Hollywood never really made the Orphan Trains a blockbuster subject, probably because it didn't fit easily into genres. Too sad for a children's movie, too quiet for a western, too bleak for a family drama. Instead, the Orphan Train became more of a background reference, appearing in TV shows, in documentaries, and in the occasional made-for-television special. Enough to keep the memory alive, but never enough to put it fully in the spotlight. It's like the trains themselves, always passing in the background, never quite stopping long enough for people to really climb aboard and sit with the reality. But where the Orphan Train truly found a second life was in genealogy. By the late 20th century, Americans were becoming obsessed with tracing their roots. Family trees, ancestry charts, DNA kits that tell you you're 1% Viking and 3% mystery. For descendants of Orphan Train riders, genealogy came with an extra layer of fog. because many of those children's pasts were erased or never recorded properly in the first place, which means a lot of modern-day people grew up with a family story that started with a blank space. Grandma came on the train, they'd say, and that was it. No details, no humtun, no original parents' names, just the train. That kind of mystery sticks in families. It becomes part of identity, and in a way, it shows how the orphan train didn't just shape the children themselves, it shaped generations who came after, passing down the silence as much as the story. There's also something very American about how the orphan train has been remembered. It fits neatly into the national narrative of reinvention. Take a child from poverty in New York, put them on a train, and let them make it in Kansas. It's the same myth we tell about immigrants arriving through Allah's Island, about pioneers crossing the plains, about anyone who sheds an old life for a shiny new one. Never mind that the reality was uneven, that many children did make it in the way we like to imagine. The myth doesn't care about statistical outcomes. The myth cares about mood, and the orphan train story, stripped of its rough edges, delivers exactly the mood America loves: hope, reinvention, resilience. Because of course it does. America is basically built on bedtime stories we tell ourselves to fall asleep a little easier. Another interesting twist is how the orphan train connects to modern debates. Child welfare, adoption, foster care, immigration, even refugee resettlement. Whenever society argues about how to handle children in need, the orphan train floats back into conversation as an example, sometimes of noble intention, sometimes of what not to do. Politicians have cited it, social workers have studied it, educators have written papers comparing it to foster systems, and every time, the takeaway depends on what someone wants to prove. If you want to argue that children are resilient, hey, look at the orphan train. If you want to argue that systems can be cruel, hey, look at the orphan train. It's like a historical Rorschach test. People see in it whatever suits their worldview. Which, again, is kind of what myths are for. And then there are the museums. We mentioned the one in Kansas, the National Orphan Train Complex. It's not a flashy place. No giant dioramas, no roller coaster rides, just exhibits, photographs, personal artifacts, and the steady work of remembering. Visitors often describe it as haunting, not because it's dramatic, but because it's quiet, just rows of faces in old photographs. Children lined up, gazing at the camera, some hopeful, some nervous, some blank. Looking at those photos, you realize something simple but heavy. Every one of those kids had a life story, and most of those stories will never be fully known. The museum doesn't solve that, it just holds it, preserves the silence in a way that feels respectful. Which brings us back to the idea of bedtime. Because in a way, the orphan train is the ultimate bedtime story for America, not the cheerful fairy tale kind. More like the kind of story a tired parent tells at night, half true, half sanded down, with the sharp corners rounded off so it won't keep anyone awake. It's a story that soothes the conscience. Yes, we had poor children, but we tried to help. Yes, there was suffering, but there was also hope. It's not the whole truth, but it's the version you can fall asleep to. And maybe that's why we're still talking about it more than a century later, because it whispers to both sides of us, the hopeful side and the side that knows the silence is louder than the words. So as we dim the lights a little more, let's step back once again. The orphan trains aren't just history, they're a mirror. A mirror that reflects what we wanted to believe about ourselves and what we didn't want to admit. And mirrors, as you know, are best looked at quietly in the half-light when no one else is awake. So here we are. The last car on the track, the last echo of the whistle. The children are long gone, the prairie towns have changed, and the Orphan Train exists now only in memory, in myth, and in museums. But like all quiet pieces of history, it leaves us with more questions than answers. What happened to the children we'll never find? Did they blend into families forgotten in the census lists, buried in unmarked grave? Or did some carry the silence so deeply that their descendants still feel it generations later? And what about the reformers, the Charles Loring Braces of the world, who genuinely believed they were doing good? Were they visionaries, or were they just people with too much confidence in their own ideas and too little attention to the actual lives of children? The truth, as usual, sits somewhere in the messy middle. The Orphan Train did help some children. It gave them stability, homes, chances they would never have had in the streets of New York. But it also uprooted thousands. It erased identities. It scattered families, and it left wounds that couldn't always be named. If there's a lesson here, it might be that every generation invents its own way of fixing childhood poverty. Sometimes those fixes are well-meaning. Sometimes they're clumsy. Sometimes they're just cruel, dressed up in kindness. The Orphan Train wasn't the first. It wasn't the last. And if you squint at today's debates about foster care, adoption, refugee children, or even border policies, you can hear faint echoes of the same logic. We know best, the children will adapt, the past doesn't matter. And history, of course, likes to whisper back. Are you sure about that? But let's not end on a sharp note. This is bedtime history, after all. So picture it like this. It's the 1880s. You're a child standing at a train station in Missouri. The sun is low. The air smells like dust and coal smoke. You've been told to smile at the strangers who have come to see the children from the east. You don't really know what's happening. The whistle blows, the crowd shifts, a farmer points at you. And your life is about to change forever. Fast forward decades later, you're old now, sitting in a wooden chair. Maybe you're rocking gently, maybe you're just still. Someone asks where you came from, and you answer softly, on the train. That's it, that's your story. And it drifts away like a lullaby, unfinished, unresolved, but strangely calming in its quiet. The Orphan Train is gone. The children are gone. But the questions linger like faint tracks in the prairie grass. And maybe that's enough. All right, take a slow breath. Stretch if you need to. Let your eyes close if they want to. Because that, my friends, is the end of the Orphan Train story. But since bedtime is long and history is endless, we're not stopping here. Oh no. Because if you thought the story of missing children on trains was strange, wait until you hear about European monarchs who made keeping it in the family into a full-time royal hobby. Spoiler, it did not end well for their jawlines. So next, we're gliding gently across the ocean, into palaces and courts, to peek at some of the most inbred monarchs in European history. Let's just say, crowns weren't the only things passed down in those families. So we've said goodbye to the orphan trains. The prairie is quiet, the echoes have faded, and now let's float somewhere very different: palaces, thrones, crowns. But don't get too excited, because as glamorous as European royalty sounds, tonight we are focusing on the weirdest, most tragic detail of all: how many kings and queens were basically their own cousins. Yes, we're talking about inbreeding. Because when you spend centuries marrying your nieces, nephews, and double first cousins just to keep the bloodline pure, you end up with heirs who look less like divine rulers and more like half-baked potatoes with very expensive jewelry. Let's start with the Habsburgs, because honestly, where else could we begin? The Habsburg dynasty ruled large parts of Europe for centuries: Austria, Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, bits of Italy, the Netherlands. Their motto might as well have been, "Why look outside the family when your cousin is right here?" The result, A family tree that's less of a tree and more of a tangled shrub. Branches looping back into themselves, names repeating endlessly, and genetic material getting recycled like yesterday's soup. Their most famous genetic calling card was something historians politely call the Habsburg jaw. Picture this, a lower jaw so pronounced it looked like it was trying to escape the rest of the face. Thick lips, drooping chins, and difficulty chewing or even speaking. Generations of portraits show this same unfortunate chin marching through time, like a hereditary curse with very fancy collars. One of the worst cases belonged to Charles II of Spain, nicknamed El Hechizado or the Bewitched. Spoiler, it wasn't witchcraft, it was just centuries of uncle-niece marriages. Charles II was, by all accounts, a royal disaster. Born in 1661, he was the product of so much inbreeding that modern geneticists estimate his inbreeding coefficient was higher than if his parents had been siblings, which, fun fact, they nearly were. He didn't learn to walk until age 8. He couldn't speak properly until much later. He suffered from seizures, physical disabilities, and constant illnesses. And perhaps most famously, he couldn't produce an heir, ending centuries of Spanish Habsburg rule. One court physician wrote that Charles had the constitution of a chicken, which, while not very scientific, feels about right. Imagine being the king of one of the richest empires in the world and still not being able to chew dinner without difficulty. That was Charles, the most powerful man in Spain, who lived his whole life as proof that too many cousin marriages will eventually catch up with you. But Charles wasn't alone. The Habsburgs had a long tradition of marrying close relatives. Ferdinand I married his cousin. Philip I married his niece. And that was considered normal, because why dilute the royal bloodline with fresh DNA when you can just recycle? The irony, of course, is that this obsession with purity didn't make the dynasty stronger. It made it weaker. By the late 1600s, the Spanish Habsburg line collapsed entirely, thanks to infertility, illness, and Charles II's inability to produce children. So in trying to preserve their power, they basically bred themselves out of existence, which is kind of the most Habsburg ending possible. Now, before we drift further into royal disasters, let's pause on something. The Orphan Train story showed us how children were uprooted and erased in America. Now we are watching the opposite problem: children born into too much family, too much expectation, and way too little genetic variety. Different continents, different problems, but both are bedtime stories about what happens when adults make very confident decisions about children's lives. And both, as you can hear, end up a little tragic, a little absurd, and oddly calming to listen to in the dark. But don't worry, the Habsburgs aren't our only royal mess. Next, we'll float over to England, where the Tudors, the Stuarts, and eventually even Queen Victoria got tangled in their own family webs. And then maybe to Russia, where the Romanovs had their share of genetic surprises too. Spoiler, hemophilia makes an appearance, because apparently royal families liked passing down medical conditions almost as much as they liked passing down crowns.